The blood trail started at the gate and disappeared into the twilight shadows. But Quinn Xavier had already spotted her slumped figure against his fence post before his mare had even come to a full stop. September 1878 brought cool evenings to Wichita, Kansas, and this woman looked like she'd been riding through hell itself to get here. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a gash that leaked crimson down her arm, and her face was pale as moonlight except where dirt and dried blood had painted strange patterns across her cheeks. She didn't speak, didn't cry out, just watched him with eyes that held more wariness than pain. Quinn dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. He was a tall man, lean and weathered from years working cattle across the Kansas plains, with hands that knew how to gentle a spooked horse and mend a broken fence. Those same hands reached for her now, and she flinched but didn't pull away. Something in her stillness told him she'd made a choice to be here, at his gate, and not somewhere else. "Can you walk?" he asked, keeping his voice low and steady. She nodded once, a small movement that seemed to cost her something. Quinn offered his arm and she took it, her grip surprisingly strong despite the blood loss. He guided her toward the small ranch house, a sturdy structure he'd built himself 3 years back when he'd finally saved enough to buy this land. The porch steps creaked under their combined weight, a familiar sound that usually meant coming home after a long day. Tonight it meant something different entirely. Inside, he settled her into the chair by the kitchen table, the same chair where he took his morning coffee and read the occasional newspaper from town. She sank into it like her legs had been holding her up through sheer determination alone. Quinn lit the oil lamp, flooding the room with warm light that made the blood on her dress look even darker. Her eyes followed his movements as he gathered supplies: clean cloth, his mother's sewing kit, a bottle of whiskey he kept for rare occasions, and a basin of water from the pump. He rolled up his sleeves and pulled another chair close to hers, close enough that their knees almost touched. When he reached for her wounded shoulder, she turned slightly to give him better access, still without speaking. The silence between them felt heavy but not uncomfortable, like they'd both agreed that words would only complicate whatever understanding they were building in this moment. The wound was deep, probably from a knife rather than a bullet, and it would need stitching. Quinn had sewn up his share of injuries over the years, both animal and human, though he'd never quite gotten used to the way flesh resisted the needle. He poured whiskey over the gash first, and this time she did make a sound, a sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth. Her hand gripped the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. "I know," he said quietly, threading the needle. "I know it hurts." She met his eyes then, really met them, and he saw something flicker in their brown depths. Gratitude maybe, or surprise that he wasn't demanding answers. Most men would have wanted the whole story before offering help. Quinn figured the story would come when she was ready, or it wouldn't come at all. Either way, she needed doctoring first. He worked carefully, each stitch placed with the kind of patience he'd learned from years of ranch work. Nothing good came from rushing, his father used to say, and Quinn had found that to be true in most aspects of life. The woman sat perfectly still except for the occasional tremor when the needle pierced skin. She didn't cry, didn't complain, just breathed through it with a discipline that spoke of hard experience. When he finished, Quinn tied off the thread and cut it with his pocket knife. He cleaned the area once more and wrapped it with clean cloth, his fingers brushing against her bare shoulder. Her skin was warm despite her pallor, and he felt her pulse jumping rapid and light beneath his touch. She was alive, and she would stay that way if infection didn't set in. "You'll need to rest," Quinn said, sitting back, "and eat something if you can manage it." She nodded again, and he wondered if she could speak at all or if she'd chosen silence for reasons of her own. He stood and moved to the stove, stoking the fire and setting a pot of yesterday's stew to warm. The routine actions helped settle his mind, though he kept glancing over his shoulder to make sure she was still there, still breathing, still real and not some apparition conjured by too many lonely evenings. While the stew heated, Quinn pumped fresh water and brought her a cup. She took it with both hands, drinking slowly at first and then more eagerly. When she finished, she set the cup down and looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations he couldn't quite hear. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was rough from disuse or screaming or maybe just the dust of hard riding. 2 words, but they carried weight. "You're welcome," Quinn replied and meant it. He served the stew in 2 bowls, and they ate together at the table, the scrape of spoons against tin, the only sound besides the pop and hiss of the fire. Quinn tried not to stare, but he couldn't help noticing details. The way her hair, dark brown and tangled, had come loose from what might have once been a neat braid, the freckles scattered across her nose, the calluses on her hands that suggested she knew hard work. She was younger than him, he guessed, maybe 23 or 24 to his 31 years, but there was an old quality to her gaze that had nothing to do with age. When they finished eating, exhaustion seemed to crash over her all at once. Her eyelids drooped and her shoulders sagged, the adrenaline that had carried her this far finally depleting. Quinn stood and gestured toward the bedroom, the only real bedroom in the house. "You can sleep there," he said. "I'll take the floor out here." She opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it again and simply nodded. He helped her up and guided her to the room, where his bed stood neatly made with quilts his mother had sewn before she passed. The woman sat on the edge of the mattress and looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Clara Hayes." "Quinn Xavier," he replied, filing away the gift of her name like something precious. "You're safe here, Clara. Whatever you're running from, it won't find you tonight." Something in her face shifted, a crack in the armor she'd been wearing. For just a moment he saw fear there, real and raw, before she locked it away again. She lay down on top of the quilts, not bothering to undress or even remove her dusty boots. Sleep claimed her almost instantly, her breathing evening out into the steady rhythm of the deeply exhausted. Quinn stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep and wondering what storm had blown her to his gate. Then he closed the door quietly and returned to the main room, where he made a rough bed from blankets on the floor. It wasn't the first time he'd slept this way, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Comfort mattered less than knowing Clara Hayes was resting somewhere safe. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch at night. Cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees, the old house settling on its foundations. But underneath it all, he heard something new, the soft sound of a woman's breathing in his bedroom, and it changed everything. Morning came with golden light streaming through the kitchen window, and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. Quinn had risen before dawn as always, fed the animals, and started the day's work before remembering he had a guest. He'd hurried back to the house to find Clara already awake, standing in the bedroom doorway looking uncertain and fragile in the morning light. "How's the shoulder?" he asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Sore," she admitted, accepting the cup he offered, "but better. You did good work." They sat at the table again, and in the daylight Quinn could see her more clearly. She was beautiful in an understated way, with delicate features that hardened into something fierce when she thought he wasn't looking. The wound on her shoulder had bled through the bandage slightly, but not enough to worry him. She'd heal, given time and rest. "I should explain," Clara began, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "You don't owe me explanations," Quinn said. "You needed help, I gave it. But you deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into." She took a breath, steadying herself. "My husband died 6 months ago. Fever took him quick, left me with nothing but debt, and a piece of land that wasn't worth the paper the deed was written on. His brother, Henry Hayes, decided the property should go to him instead. When I wouldn't leave, he tried to make me." Her hand moved unconsciously to her wounded shoulder, and Quinn felt anger kindle in his chest. He kept his expression neutral, waiting for her to continue. "I fought back," Clara said simply. "Got my horse and rode. I've been moving for 3 days, sleeping rough, trying to stay ahead of him." "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door, Quinn. I just saw your light and I couldn't go any further." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Quinn said, and he meant it with a conviction that surprised him. "This ranch is big enough for 2, and I could use help around here if you're willing to work for your keep." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You do that? For a stranger?" "You're not a stranger anymore," Quinn said. "You're Clara Hayes, and you need a safe place to heal." "Seems simple enough to me." She laughed, a sound that started quiet and grew stronger. "Nothing's simple in my experience, but I appreciate your thinking so. And yes, I can work. I'm good with horses and I've kept a garden. I can cook better than whatever that stew was last night, no offense." "None taken," Quinn said, grinning. "My cooking's about as basic as it gets. If you can improve on it, I'll consider myself lucky." They settled into an arrangement that felt natural despite its strangeness. Clara took over the kitchen and the vegetable garden Quinn had been neglecting, while he continued his work with the cattle and horses. She proved true to her word about cooking, turning simple ingredients into meals that actually had flavor and variety. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk, sharing stories about their lives in careful increments. Quinn learned that Clara had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher who died when she was young. She'd married Thomas Hayes at 19, hoping for stability and partnership, and had gotten a few good years before the fever took him. She spoke about Thomas with fondness but not deep passion, and Quinn understood that theirs had been a practical match more than a love story. Clara learned that Quinn had come to Kansas with his parents as a boy, that his father had worked himself to death building a cattle empire for someone else, that his mother had followed not long after. Quinn had saved every penny to buy this land, to build something that belonged to him alone. He'd been content with solitude, or so he'd thought, until Clara arrived and showed him what his life had been missing. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's shoulder healed clean without infection. She could have left, should have left by any reasonable measure, but she stayed. Quinn told himself it was because she was still afraid of Henry Hayes finding her, but he knew it was more than that. Something was growing between them, tender and tentative like the first shoots of spring plants pushing through winter soil. One evening in early October, they were working together to repair a section of fence when Clara paused and looked at him across the post they'd just set. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and her face glowed in the fading light. "Why didn't you ask me any questions that first night?" she said. Most men would have demanded answers before lifting a finger to help. Quinn considered this, his hand still on the fence rail. "I figured you'd tell me what I needed to know when the time was right. And if you never told me, well, that was your business. You needed help. The rest didn't matter." "It mattered to me," Clara said softly. "I'd spent so long around people who wanted to control me, to own my story along with everything else. You just let me be." "Everyone deserves that," Quinn replied. "The right to their own story." Clara moved around the fence post until she was standing close to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "I'm glad I ended up at your gate that night," Even bleeding and half dead, it was the best decision I ever made. Quinn's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. I'm glad, too. This place has felt more like home in the past few weeks than it has in the 3 years I've owned it. She reached out and took his hand, her calloused palm fitting against his like they'd been designed to match. They stood there as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars emerged, not speaking, just holding on to each other and the moment they were building together. That night, after supper, they sat closer than usual on the porch. Quinn found the courage to put his arm around her shoulders, careful of her healing wound, and Clara leaned into him with a sigh that sounded like relief. They talked about small things and big dreams, about whether to expand the cattle herd or invest in more horses, about what the winter might bring and how to prepare for it. I'd like to stay, Clara said eventually. Not just until I feel safe from Henry, but permanently, if you'll have me. Quinn turned to look at her, his heart full of something that felt dangerously close to love. I'd like that more than just about anything, but I want you to stay because you want to, not because you feel obligated or because you're still afraid. I am still afraid, Clara admitted. But that's not why I want to stay. I want to stay because when I look at the future, I see it here with you. I see us building something real together. I see home. Then stay, Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. Stay and let's build that future together. She kissed him then, soft and sweet under the stars, and Quinn felt like every hard year of his life had been leading to this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. We should probably get married, Clara said practically, for propriety's sake if nothing else. People in town are going to talk enough as it is, Quinn laughed. Is that a proposal, Clara Hayes? I suppose it is, she said, grinning. Quinn Xavier, will you marry me? Yes, he said simply. Yes, I will. They were married 3 weeks later in Wichita's small church, with a handful of Quinn's neighbors standing witness. Clara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Quinn had bought at the general store, and she carried wildflowers they'd picked that morning from the prairie. Quinn wore his best shirt and the string tie he saved for rare occasions, and he'd never felt more proud than when Clara took his hand and spoke her vows with a clear, strong voice. The preacher, a kindly old man named Reverend Mitchell, pronounced them husband and wife with a smile that suggested he approved of the match. Quinn kissed his bride in front of God and witnesses, and the small gathering cheered. Afterward, they had a modest celebration at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink, musicians playing fiddles, and dancing that lasted until the stars came out. When everyone finally left and they were alone, Quinn carried Clara over the threshold of their home. She laughed and protested that it was silly, but he insisted. Inside, they stood together in the lamplight, suddenly shy with each other despite everything they'd shared. I never thought I'd marry again, Clara said, her hands resting on his chest. After Thomas, I thought that part of my life was over. I never thought I'd marry at all, Quinn admitted. I figured I was meant to work this land alone. We were both wrong, Clara said, smiling, and I'm so glad we were. That night, they came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other in the way of new lovers who know they have all the time in the world. Quinn discovered the map of freckles across Clara's shoulders, the way she sighed when he kissed her neck, the strength in her hands when she pulled him close. Clara learned the scars Quinn carried from years of ranch work, the tenderness beneath his weathered exterior, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the quilts, Clara's head on Quinn's chest and his arms wrapped around her. Through the window, they could see the vast Kansas sky filled with stars, the same stars that had watched over them that first night when she'd arrived bleeding and silent at his gate. I love you, Clara whispered into the darkness. "I know it's fast, but I do. I love you, Quinn." "I love you too," he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "From the moment I saw you at my gate, I think some part of me knew you were going to change my life." "For better or worse?" she asked. "For better," he said firmly. "Always for better." They drifted to sleep wrapped in each other, and Quinn thought that this was what contentment felt like, this warmth and peace and bone-deep rightness of Clara beside him. The winter of 1878 came hard and cold, with snow that piled in drifts against the house and wind that howled through the cottonwoods. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and laughter. Quinn and Clara worked together to keep the livestock fed and safe, to maintain the buildings against the weather, to preserve what they'd built. They grew closer through the long nights, sharing stories and dreams, planning for the spring. Clara proved herself invaluable in 100 small ways. She had a gift with the horses that Quinn couldn't match, able to gentle even the most skittish mare with patience and soft words. She kept their home comfortable and organized, mended clothes and harnesses, and turned their simple meals into something approaching luxury with her cooking skills. But more than any practical contribution, she brought joy to Quinn's life, a lightness he hadn't known he was missing. In February, when the worst of the winter had passed but spring still seemed impossibly far away, Clara came to Quinn with news that made his heart leap. She was pregnant, likely due in September if her calculations were correct. Quinn swept her up carefully and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Clara asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Quinn said. Terrified, excited, grateful, all of it at once. They spent the rest of winter preparing, Quinn building a cradle from oak wood and Clara sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric. They talked about names and futures, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the legacy they hoped to leave their child. The baby wasn't even born yet, but already it had changed them, given them a shared purpose that went beyond their own happiness. Spring arrived with wildflowers and new calves, and with it came trouble Quinn had hoped they'd avoided. Henry Hayes rode up to the ranch on a gray April morning, bringing 3 men with him. Quinn saw them coming from the north pasture and rode hard back to the house, his heart in his throat. Clara was inside, and she went pale when Quinn told her who'd arrived. But she squared her shoulders and stood beside him as he went to meet their visitors, her hand resting protectively on her slightly rounded belly. Henry Hayes was a big man, thick through the shoulders with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes. He dismounted and looked Clara over with an expression that made Quinn's hands curl into fists. "There you are," Henry said, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Been looking for you for months, Clara. You've led me on quite a chase." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear Quinn could see in her eyes. "I have a life here now, a husband." Henry's gaze shifted to Quinn, dismissive and measuring. "This the cowboy who's been hiding you. Doesn't look like much." "I'm not hiding her," Quinn said calmly, though anger simmered beneath his words. "She's my wife, legally married. Whatever claim you think you have on her ended when she said I do." "The land Thomas left is family property," Henry said. "She had no right to refuse it to me." "I signed over the deed to you before I left Missouri," Clara said. "I left it with the county clerk. You got what you wanted, Henry. This is just about your pride." Henry's expression darkened. "You made a fool of me running off like that. People talked. They still talk. I came all this way to set things right." "There's nothing to set right," Quinn said, stepping slightly in front of Clara. "You have your land, and Clara has her life here with me. Best thing for everyone is if you ride back the way you came." The three men with Henry shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Quinn's own gun was at his hip, and he had a rifle in the house, but he didn't want this to turn violent. Not with Clara pregnant, not when they'd built something worth protecting. "I could make trouble for you," Henry said, his eyes calculating. "Tell the law you're harboring a woman who abandoned her legal obligations. Make life difficult." "You could try," Quinn agreed. "But I know the sheriff in Wichita, and he knows me. He also knows the law, which says Clara was free to leave that property once she settled the estate. You're the one who came after her, who cut her with a knife when she tried to stand up for herself. Now who do you think the law is going to side with?" Henry's hand moved to his gun, and everything seemed to slow down. Quinn prepared to draw, knowing this could go badly, knowing he might not be fast enough to protect Clara from whatever came next. But before anyone could clear leather, a new voice rang out across the yard. "I'd think very carefully before you do something stupid, Hayes." Sheriff Tom Brennan rode into the yard with two deputies, guns already drawn. Quinn had never been so relieved to see the lawman in his life. Tom was a fair man, honest in a profession that didn't always attract honesty, and he'd known Quinn since he first arrived in Wichita. "This is a private matter," Henry said, but his hand had moved away from his gun. "Private matters tend to stay private," Tom said, dismounting. "But when I hear that a man's been asking around town about a woman he's tracking, a woman who happens to be married to a friend of mine, well, I figure that's worth investigating." "Clara is family," Henry tried. "Clara is Quinn Xavier's wife," Tom corrected. "And from what I hear, she left Missouri with all her affairs in order. You're the one who followed her here looking for trouble. Now you've got three choices. Ride out peaceful, face charges for assault from that knife wound you gave her, or try something stupid and see how that works out for you." Henry looked at his men, at the sheriff's deputies with their guns trained steady, at Quinn standing protective in front of Clara. Whatever calculation he made, it came down on the side of discretion. He mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. "This isn't finished," he said to Clara. "Yes, it is," she replied firmly. "It's been finished since the day I left. You just weren't willing to accept it." Henry wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following. Quinn and Clara stood together and watched them disappear toward the horizon, relief washing through them both. Tom holstered his gun and approached the porch. "Thank you," Quinn said, shaking the sheriff's hand. "You showed up at exactly the right time." "Got a telegram from Missouri last week," Tom said. "County clerk there wanted to make sure Clara had arrived safely, wanted me to know that Henry Hayes had been making threats. Figured I should keep an eye out. Good thing I did." "Will he come back?" Clara asked quietly. "I doubt it," Tom said. "Men like that are bullies, and bullies back down when they're faced with real consequences. But if he does, you send word immediately. I'll make sure he regrets it." After the sheriff left, Quinn and Clara stood on the porch holding each other, the adrenaline slowly fading. Clara was shaking, and Quinn rubbed her back gently, murmuring reassurances. "It's really over," she said, as if testing the words. "He can't touch me anymore." "It's over," Quinn confirmed. "You're safe. We're safe." That night they held each other close, grateful for what they'd preserved and protected. The baby moved for the first time, a flutter against Clara's belly that made them both laugh with delight. Life continued, pushing forward despite threats and fears, insistent and beautiful. Summer came in waves of heat, and the hard work of running a ranch. Clara's belly grew round and full, and Quinn found himself constantly amazed by the changes in her body, the way she carried their child with such grace. They hired a young cowhand named Billy to help with the extra work, a good kid who needed a chance and proved himself worthy of it. The ranch prospered. Quinn's cattle herd grew, and he added more horses, including a breeding pair that Clara had her eye on. They expanded the house slightly, adding a proper room for the baby and a bigger kitchen for Clara. Every nail Quinn hammered felt like he was building their future, making something permanent and real. On a warm evening in late August, Clara and Quinn sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. She was moving slowly now, heavy with the baby, but she insisted on maintaining her routines as much as possible. Quinn had learned not to argue, instead just staying close in case she needed him. "I've been thinking about names," Clara said, her hands resting on her belly. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father." "What was his name, James?" Quinn said, touched by the offer. "James Matthew Xavier." "But Clara, you don't have to, I want to," she interrupted gently. "Your father built the foundation you're standing on, even if he didn't get to see what you made of it. That deserves to be honored." "And if it's a girl?" Quinn asked. Clara smiled. "I was thinking Rose. Rosalina after my mother. Simple names for a simple life." "There's nothing simple about what we've built," Quinn said, taking her hand. "But I like both names. James or Rose Xavier. Either way, they'll be lucky to have you as a mother." "Lucky to have us both," Clara corrected. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Quinn, patient and kind and strong. Everything a child needs." The baby arrived on September 10, 1879, exactly 1 year after Clara had appeared at Quinn's gate. The labor was long and difficult, and Quinn spent most of it pacing the porch while the midwife and neighbor women attended Clara inside. Her cries of pain tore at him, made him feel helpless in a way he'd never experienced. But when the baby finally came, when he heard that first lusty wail, everything else fell away. The midwife emerged to find Quinn sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "You have a son," she said, smiling. "A healthy boy with good lungs, and Clara did just fine. She's asking for you." Quinn rushed inside to find his wife propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the quilts his mother had made. Clara looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and Quinn had never seen anything more beautiful. "James," she said softly. "James Matthew Xavier, come meet your son." Quinn sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby in Clara's arms. His son had a shock of dark hair and a scrunched-up face that made him look perpetually surprised. Tiny fists waved in the air, and when one of them brushed Quinn's finger, the baby gripped it with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Quinn breathed, wonder and love overwhelming him. "Clara, he's absolutely perfect. He has your nose," Clara said, laughing through her tears. "Poor thing." Quinn laughed too, the sound coming from somewhere deep and true. He leaned down to kiss Clara's forehead, then very gently touched his lips to his son's soft hair. "Thank you," he whispered to his wife. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." They sat together as the evening deepened into night, their new family of 3, and Quinn thought about the journey that had brought them here. 1 year ago, Clara had arrived bleeding and silent, and he'd helped her without question. Now they had this, a life and a future and a son who represented all the hope and possibility in the world. The first weeks with baby James were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. He nursed well and slept poorly, keeping Clara and Quinn up at all hours. But neither of them minded the sleepless nights, too enchanted by every sound and movement their son made. Billy stepped up to handle more of the ranch work, and the neighbors brought food and advice in the way of communities that took care of their own. Quinn discovered a tenderness in himself he hadn't known existed. He could spend hours just watching James sleep, marveling at the tiny perfection of his ears and fingers and toes. When the baby cried, Quinn learned to walk him around the house, bouncing gently and humming old songs his mother had sung. Clara would watch them with soft eyes, her love for Quinn deepening as she saw him embrace fatherhood with his whole heart. By the time winter arrived again, they'd found their rhythm as parents. James was growing fast, his dark hair coming in thick, and his eyes settling into a blue-gray that reminded Quinn of Kansas storm clouds. The baby smiled and cooed, reaching for their faces with grabby hands, and every new development felt like a miracle. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft outside and the fire crackling warm inside, Quinn gave Clara a gift he'd been working on in secret. It was a wooden box, beautifully carved with scenes from their life together. The ranch house, horses running free, and in the center, a woman on horseback approaching a gate where a man waited. "It's our story," Quinn said as Clara traced the carvings with gentle fingers. "So we never forget how we began." Clara opened the box to find a delicate gold locket inside, simple but lovely. She opened it to discover a tiny photograph Quinn had commissioned in town, showing the three of them together, a family. "Quinn," she breathed, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's beautiful, all of it." "You're beautiful," he said, taking the locket and fastening it around her neck. "And brave and strong and everything I never knew I needed. I love you, Clara Xavier." "I love you too," she said, kissing him while baby James made happy sounds from his cradle nearby. "More than I ever thought possible." They celebrated quietly that Christmas, just the three of them and Billy, who'd become like family. They exchanged small gifts and ate Clara's cooking and sang carols with more enthusiasm than skill. James stayed up later than usual, fascinated by the candles on the tree Quinn had cut. And when he finally fell asleep, it was in his father's arms, safe and warm and loved. The years that followed were full of the kind of happiness that comes from ordinary days lived well. The ranch continued to prosper, growing from Quinn's modest operation into something substantial. They hired more hands as needed, built additional outbuildings, and purchased more land when the opportunity arose. Clara proved as savvy a businesswoman as she was a wife and mother, helping Quinn make decisions that secured their financial future. James grew into a bright, active boy who loved horses and followed his father everywhere. By the time he was 3, he could sit a horse with supervision, and by 5 he was helping with small ranch tasks. He had Clara's warm nature and Quinn's steady temperament, a combination that made him easy to love and easy to raise. In 1882, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a healthy daughter they named Rose Alina in July. Rose had her mother's brown eyes and delicate features, and she wrapped both her father and brother around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. James took his role as big brother seriously, always wanting to help with the baby, bringing her toys and singing to her in his childish voice. The ranch house rang with laughter and life now, so different from the silent structure Quinn had built for one. He and Clara would sometimes sit on the porch in the evenings, watching their children play in the yard, and marvel at how full their lives had become. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked one evening, Rose asleep in her arms and James catching fireflies nearby. "When I showed up at your gate, all the time," Quinn admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if you hadn't come here or if I'd turned you away." "Would you have?" Clara asked. "Turn me away?" Quinn considered this seriously. "No," he said finally. "Even if I'd known all the complications that would come with helping you, I still would have done it. Some things are just meant to be." "We're meant to be," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder. "We are," Quinn agreed, wrapping his arm around her carefully so as not to disturb sleeping Rose. "Absolutely meant to be." As the 1880s progressed, Wichita grew from a rough cattle town into a proper city. The railroad brought more people and commerce, and civilization slowly tamed the wild edges of Kansas. The Xaviers adapted with the times, diversifying their ranch operation and becoming respected members of the community. Quinn served on the town council for a term, and Clara organized a school for ranch children who lived too far out to attend town classes regularly. Their family remained at the center of everything they did. James grew tall and strong, taking after his father in build and his mother in temperament. Rose was smaller but fierce, with a will of iron beneath her sweet exterior. In 1885, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas after Clara's first husband, a gesture of respect for the past that had led them to each other. And in 1888, their youngest, a daughter named Ruth, completed their family. The ranch house expanded again to accommodate their growing brood. Rooms added in all directions until it bore little resemblance to the small structure Quinn had originally built. But the heart of it remained the same, the kitchen where Clara and Quinn had shared that first silent meal, the bedroom where she'd slept that first night, the porch where they'd sat and fallen in love under the stars. Quinn's hair began to gray at the temples, and Clara found silver threads in her own dark hair, but they aged together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They'd learned each other so thoroughly that they could communicate with a glance, anticipate needs before they were spoken, work together with the seamless coordination of longtime partners. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Quinn took Clara on a trip to Kansas City, just the two of them, leaving the children in Billy's capable care. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in nice restaurants, and walked through parks and museums like young courting couples. It was a different kind of romance than what they'd built at the ranch, more polished and urban, but it reminded them that beneath the roles of parents and ranchers, they were still Quinn and Clara, husband and wife, lovers and best friends. "I'd do it all again," Clara said as they stood on the hotel balcony looking out over the city lights. "Every moment exactly the same. Even the part where you showed up bleeding at my gate," Quinn asked, pulling her close. "Especially that part," Clara said. "Because that's where our story started. That's where I found home." They returned to the ranch refreshed and even more committed to the life they'd built. The children were growing fast, James already talking about his own future running the ranch, Rose showing an aptitude for horses that surpassed even her mother's, Thomas proving himself a natural leader, and little Ruth charming everyone with her sunny disposition. The 1890s brought new challenges and opportunities. A drought tested their water resources, but Quinn's careful planning and the well he'd dug years earlier saw them through. A particularly harsh winter in 1893 killed some livestock, but they diversified enough that the loss was manageable. Through it all, Quinn and Clara faced everything together, their partnership unshakable. James married in 1895, bringing home a smart young woman named Elizabeth who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far edge of the Xavier property and started their own family, making Quinn and Clara grandparents for the first time in 1896, when little Sarah was born. Holding his granddaughter, Quinn felt the circle of life completing itself, understanding finally what his own father must have dreamed of when he worked himself to death building something for the future. Rose chose not to marry, instead focusing on developing the horse breeding program that had become the ranch's most profitable venture. She had her mother's independence and her father's business sense, and together they made the Xavier horses known throughout Kansas and beyond. Thomas went to college, the first in either Quinn's or Clara's family to do so, studying agriculture and bringing home new ideas about crop rotation and land management. Ruth, the youngest, became a teacher, eventually running the school Clara had started years before. As the new century approached, Quinn and Clara found themselves entering their 50s, slowing down but not stopping. They spent more time on the porch now, less time in the saddle, content to let their children and grandchildren carry forward what they'd built. But they were still partners in every sense, still in love in the deep, comfortable way of people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other through decades of life. On September 10, 1899, exactly 21 years after Clara had arrived at Quinn's gate, they held a celebration at the ranch. All 4 children came with their families. Billy, who was now the ranch foreman and like an uncle to the Xavier kids, neighbors and friends from throughout the county. They barbecued beef from their own cattle, and Clara baked pies that people still talked about years later. As the sun set and the party continued, Quinn found Clara standing alone by the gate where she'd first appeared. He walked over and took her hand, looking at the spot where he'd found her all those years ago. "I was so scared that night," Clara said quietly. "Bleeding, exhausted, not knowing if you'd help or turn me away. I didn't know I was choosing my whole future when I rode up to this gate." "Neither did I," Quinn said. "I just knew you needed help. Everything else came after." "Everything good came after," Clara corrected. "Our marriage, our children, this whole life. All because you helped without asking questions." "Best decision I ever made," Quinn said, kissing her hand. "Then, and every day since, when I choose you again." They stood together in the twilight, surrounded by the sound of their family's laughter, looking out over the land they'd built into a legacy. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, the same prairie that had brought Clara to Quinn's gate, the same land that had witnessed their love story from its bleeding, silent beginning to this moment of peace and plenty. "I love you," Clara said, the same words she'd spoken on their wedding night, in the delivery room with each of their children, in moments of crisis and moments of joy. "I love you too," Quinn replied, the same answer he'd given then and would give until his last breath. Always and forever. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Quinn and Clara walked back to their family, their hands still joined the way they'd been for 21 years. Behind them, the gate stood silent witness, the place where 2 strangers had become everything to each other, where a cowboy's simple act of kindness had bloomed into a love story that would be told for generations. Their children and grandchildren called them over, wanting to toast the anniversary, to celebrate the couple who'd built this empire of love and land from nothing but determination and devotion. Quinn and Clara stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the fruits of their partnership, and knew that every hard moment, every challenge overcome, every choice made had led them exactly where they were meant to be. The party continued long into the night, music and dancing and stories told around the fire. But eventually, everyone went home or to bed, and Quinn and Clara found themselves alone on the porch once more, in the place where they'd spent so many evenings falling in love and staying in love. "What do you think the next 20 years will bring?" Clara asked, resting her head on Quinn's shoulder. "More of the same, I hope," Quinn said. "More mornings waking up beside you, more evenings sitting right here, more of this life we've made together." "That sounds perfect," Clara said softly. And it was perfect, or as close to perfect as life ever gets. They had their health and their family, their land and their legacy. They had each other, which had been the foundation of everything else from that first night when a bleeding, silent woman had arrived at a cowboy's gate and found not just help, but home. The years continued to pass with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. Quinn and Clara celebrated their silver anniversary in 1903 with another gathering, smaller than the 21st but no less meaningful. James had taken over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, proving himself as capable as his father. Rose's horses were winning prizes at shows throughout the region. Thomas had returned from college to implement new farming techniques that increased their crop yields. Ruth had married a doctor from Wichita and brought him into the family fold. There were 7 grandchildren now, with more on the way, and the Xavier name was synonymous with quality and integrity throughout Kansas. But none of that mattered as much to Quinn and Clara as the simple fact that they still reached for each other in the night, still found comfort and joy in each other's presence, still loved each other with the same intensity as when they'd first spoken their vows. In 1905, Quinn suffered a riding accident that laid him up for several weeks. Clara nursed him with the same patience and care he'd shown her that first night when he'd stitched her shoulder without questions. She read to him, brought him meals, sat beside his bed and told him stories about their grandchildren's latest adventures. Quinn recovered fully, but the accident reminded them both that their time was precious, that every day together was a gift. They made an effort after that to slow down even more, to savor the moments rather than rush through them. They took walks together every evening when weather permitted, Quinn's hand in Clara's, talking about everything and nothing. They sat on the porch and watched the grandchildren play, pointing out which one had inherited Clara's stubbornness or Quinn's quiet strength. They made love less frequently now, but with no less tenderness, their bodies knowing each other with the intimacy of decades. On quiet nights, they'd sometimes take out the wooden box Quinn had given Clara years ago, looking at the carvings that told their story. They'd add to it in their memories, filling in all the moments that couldn't be captured in wood. The births of their children, the first time James successfully broke a horse, Rose's fierce independence, Thomas's graduation, Ruth's wedding. The box became a touchstone, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. By 1910, Quinn and Clara were in their early 60s, considered old by frontier standards but still active and engaged with life. They'd stepped back from running the ranch entirely, content to advise when asked and otherwise enjoy their retirement. They traveled some, visiting Ruth in Wichita or going to Denver to see the mountains. But they always came home to the ranch, to the house they'd built together, to the land that had been witness to their love. One summer evening in 1911, as they sat on the porch watching yet another magnificent Kansas sunset, Clara brought up the subject they'd both been dancing around. "We should write it down," she said, "our story, for the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren who'll come after." "What story?" Quinn asked, though he knew. "How we met. How you helped a bleeding, silent stranger without asking why. How we built all this from nothing but trust and hard work and love." Clara gestured at the ranch spread out before them. "They should know how it started." "You think they'd be interested?" Quinn asked. "I think it's a good story," Clara said. "I think it shows what's possible when people choose kindness, when they take chances on each other. And I think in a world that's changing as fast as this one, it's worth remembering that some things, love and commitment and partnership, those things don't change." So they wrote it down, taking turns with the pen, filling page after page with their memories. Quinn wrote about seeing Clara at the gate, about the decision he'd made in that moment to help without requiring explanations. Clara wrote about her fear and desperation, about the relief of finding someone who would help her heal before demanding her story. Together, they chronicled their courtship, their marriage, the births of their children, the challenges they'd overcome, and the joys they'd celebrated. It took them months to complete, working in the evenings when the day's activities were done. They read passages aloud to each other, laughing at some memories and growing teary-eyed at others. When they finally finished, they had a record of their life together, a testament to what they'd built and who they'd been to each other. They bound the pages and gave copies to each of their children on Christmas of 1911. The family gathered together to read it, taking turns with different sections, and by the end there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The grandchildren asked questions, wanting to know more details about this adventure or that decision, and Quinn and Clara answered as best they could, filling in gaps and adding color to the bare facts. "This is our inheritance," James said, holding the bound pages carefully. "Not the land or the horses or the money, though those matter too, but this, the story of who you are and what you built together. This is what will pass down." Quinn and Clara held hands and accepted the gratitude and love from their family, feeling blessed beyond measure. They'd started with nothing but each other, and they'd created this. A family bound by love, a legacy that would outlast them both. The years grew shorter, or perhaps it just felt that way as Quinn and Clara moved through their 60s and into their 70s. They both remained relatively healthy, slowing down but not stopping, still devoted to each other above all else. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1928, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a gathering so large they had to hold it in the barn. Quinn was 81 now, his hair completely white but his eyes still sharp and kind. Clara was 73, her movements more careful but her spirit undimmed. They danced together at their anniversary party, slowly and carefully, while 3 generations watched and applauded. The band played an old waltz and Quinn held Clara close, marveling that they'd been given so many years together. 50 years, Clara said, her head on his shoulder. "Half a century since you stitched up my shoulder and changed my life." "Our lives," Quinn corrected gently. "You changed mine just as much." "I'm glad," Clara said. "I'm glad we found each other, glad we had all this time, glad for every single day. Even the hard ones," Quinn asked. "Especially the hard ones," Clara said, "because we got through them together and that made us stronger." They continued to dance, the music washing over them, surrounded by the evidence of their love made manifest in all these people who existed because they'd chosen each other. When the song ended, they stood together accepting congratulations and good wishes, still holding hands the way they'd done for 50 years. Quinn Xavier died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1930, 3 months shy of his 83rd birthday. He went to bed one evening after a pleasant day working in the garden with Clara, kissed his wife goodnight, and simply didn't wake up. Clara found him in the morning, still and peaceful, and though her heart broke, she was grateful he'd gone without pain or fear, still in the home they'd built together. They buried him on the ranch in a plot he'd chosen years before, under a cottonwood tree where he'd proposed to Clara all those years ago. The entire county seemed to turn out for the funeral, testament to the respect and love Quinn had earned over his lifetime. Clara stood at the graveside supported by her children, dry-eyed and dignified, celebrating a life well lived rather than mourning what was lost. After the funeral, Clara moved into the main house with James and Elizabeth, no longer strong enough to maintain her independence. She spent her days with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about Quinn, about their life together, about the night she'd arrived bleeding and silent at his gate and he'd saved her without asking why. "Did you love him right away?" one great-granddaughter asked. Clara considered this carefully. "Not right away," she said honestly, "but I trusted him right away, which was maybe more important. The love grew from that trust, and it grew stronger every day until I couldn't imagine life without him." "Do you miss him?" another child asked. "Every moment of every day," Clara said simply. "But I'm also grateful for every moment we had together. 52 years of marriage, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." Clara Hayes Xavier died in her sleep on September 10, 1932, exactly 54 years after she'd arrived at Quinn's gate. She was 77 years old, surrounded by family, at peace with the life she'd lived and the love she'd known. In her hand when they found her was the locket Quinn had given her that first Christmas, the one with their family photograph, worn smooth from decades of her touching it. They buried her next to Quinn under the cottonwood tree, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names, dates, and one line: "Together always." The family gathered again, 4 generations strong, to say goodbye to the woman who'd helped build their legacy. They told stories and sang hymns and celebrated a life that had started in fear and pain, but had bloomed into something beautiful. The ranch continued under James's stewardship, and then his children's, the Xavier name enduring through the decades. But they never forgot the story of how it all started, the tale of a bleeding woman and a cowboy who helped without questions, whose simple act of kindness had rippled forward through time to create this family, this legacy, this testament to what love could build. The wooden box Quinn had carved sat in a place of honor in the family home, passed down through the generations. Inside it now, along with the locket, were the bound pages of Quinn and Clara's story, the history they'd written together. Every new Xavier child learned about their great-great-grandparents, about the night that changed everything, about the power of compassion and trust and love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Kansas wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, family members would swear they could feel Quinn and Clara's presence on the old porch, still sitting together, still holding hands, still choosing each other across time and space, and even death itself. Because some loves are strong enough to last not just a lifetime, but forever, woven into the very fabric of the land and the legacy they leave behind. The gate where Clara had first arrived, bleeding and silent, was never removed or replaced. It became a landmark on the Xavier Ranch, maintained carefully through the years as a reminder of where everything began. Newlyweds in the family would sometimes stand there together, holding hands and making promises to each other, hoping their love would prove as enduring as Quinn and Clara's had been. As the 20th century progressed, and the world changed in ways Quinn and Clara could never have imagined, the Xavier Ranch adapted and evolved. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been, a testament to 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and had built something lasting from that first moment of trust. Their story was told and retold, growing into legend but never losing its truth, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do is help someone without asking why, love without holding back, and build a life together with patience, kindness, and unwavering devotion. And so the story that began with blood and silence ended with love and legacy, a Wild West romance that proved sometimes the greatest adventures are the ones that lead us home, to the person we were always meant to find, in the moment we were brave enough to trust.